Hey, welcome back to the Craftematics channel. My name is Kat. Today we're going to be talking about corner-to-corner crochet. Corner-to-corner crochet is a technique that often is used with color work as well. And really the only difference is that instead of working, across your rows like we do in regular crochet, or even working in the round as with other typical crochet, we're going to work from one corner all the way to the other corner. The biggest difference here is that you're not going to start with a giant chain. You're only going to have to chain 6 at a time and work into 3 of those chains. So if you really hate starting with a giant starting chain and then working into it, this is a good technique for you. The fabric it produces is also different. It has more holes and larger holes in it than a typical crochet fabric would. That's just because the technique is made up of small interlocking squares that are perpendicular to their neighbors. This makes corner-to-corner crochet really great for things like blankets and less great for things like scarves or ear warmers that are intended to really keep the wearer, away from the wind. I also highly recommend corner-to-corner for baby blankets specifically because of the gaps, which reduce the risk of suffocation in infants. One of the really great things about corner-to-corner crochet is that if you've done any crochet before, you already have the materials to get started because this does not need anything special. You don't need a special hook. You don't need any sort of accoutrement. All you need is your regular crochet hook and your yarn. Today we're going to work through this pattern together. This is a 2-color corner-to-corner dishcloth, or it can be, a mug rug or whatever kind of cloth you want it to be, that makes a little heart shape in the middle using some color work. This is a great project if this is your first corner-to-corner experience. You can also go over to my blog for a step-by-step written tutorial on how to do corner-to-corner crochet, to do a little test swatch if that makes you more comfortable to do that first. And there's also advice on how to make a blanket just like this one over on the blog post as well. Let's get started. I'm going to use Lion Brand Re-Up in 2 different colors. You can use really any yarn that you want. You just need 2 different colors to follow the color work. And I recommend using a cotton yarn specifically because this works really well as a dishcloth because it's a small project. So cotton's a really good choice for that. An appropriately sized crochet hook. I am using an H 5mm hook, tapestry needle to weave in your ends, a pair of snips, and then your pattern. I usually use an app to track my patterns, but today I just have a printed copy and a pencil. When you're working in corner-to-corner crochet, your pattern is going to look something like this. This particular pattern is going to start in the bottom left and work our way up in those diagonal rows until we finish at the other corner. I've just marked everything as A and B, so A is going to be my gray yarn and B is going to be my blue yarn. And all it's going to do is tell me how many squares of each color I want to make. So we're starting here with row 1, which uses color A, and that's my gray. To begin any corner-to-corner crochet, go ahead and make your slip knot whatever way makes you comfortable. And you're going to chain 6. So there's my chain of 6. And then I'm going to do 3 double crochets. So I'm going to start off by working into the 4th chain. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll go ahead and double crochet 1 into each of the next 3 chains. And that is my first square and also the end of my first row. So this row is done. The next row I'm still working with the gray yarn and I'm going to do 2 squares. So this is my building block, my foundational corner. My next 2 squares are going to go here and here. Whenever you're ready to add on a new row that's going to make it bigger, so here this row only had, imagine it as a diagonal row, only had 1 square. My next row needs to have 2 squares. So every time I'm increasing, I'm going to go ahead and chain 6 at the beginning of that row, just like we did to start our first corner. And just like we did to start our corner, we're going to do the exact same thing, working into that 4th chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, you're going to work a double crochet for those 3 chains. 1, 2, and 3. So now I have my 2 squares. This one is my corner, and this one's kind of just, they're free floating right now. So what I need to do is anchor this to that square from my previous row. So what I'm going to do is get my little loop here, my little chain. I'm going to slip stitch, not into this is a double crochet. I'm going to slip stitch into that last chain, that chain at the top. Slip stitch there. And now it's secure, and that has started my row 2. Notice that these stitches, my double crochets, are perpendicular to the double crochets from the previous row. So to finish my row, I'm going to chain 3, and then I'm going to double crochet 3 into this chain loop. And this is pretty much what you're going to be doing for most of your squares, is chaining 3 and then double crocheting for 3 into a chain loop. It's really only when you get to the ends of a row that you have to really pay attention to what you're doing. So that's it for row 2. Let's move on to row 3. Row 3, we're still working only with this color, and we need 3 squares. 1, 2, 3. So we do want to make it bigger, which means we'll chain 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Turn it. Notice when you turn, you kind of, it's not just a straight turn, it's kind of like a diagonal flippy-do. That's a word. So working again into that 4th chain, 1, 2, 3, 4. Do your double crochets. 2, 3. We need to secure this now so that it continues this piece, this side of the dishcloth. So again, grab your last chain from up here and go ahead and slip stitch into that. Now it's secure. Chain 3. These are just your regular blocks. Chain 3 and then double crochet 3 into that chained loop. 1, 2, 3. This is, you haven't seen this before. Very similar. We made our block, but it's not secure to the next piece. So just like we did for the last 2 beginnings of the row, we need to secure this block to its neighbor. So find the last chain in the block next to you and just slip stitch through it. And now it's nice and secure. So make another regular block, chain 3, and then double crochet 3 into that loop. There we go, that's it for row 3. You can see rows 4, 5, and 6 are exactly the same. We're going to increase 1 block for each row, working it like this in these diagonal rows. And by the end of row 6, we should have 6 squares. So to review, When you start a new row and you're getting bigger, you do the chain 6, double crochet 3, anchor it, and then you've got your regular blocks all the way to the end of the row. So you chain 3, double crochet 3 into the loop, anchor it, chain 3, double crochet 3 into the loop, anchor it, chain 3, double crochet 3 into the loop, and there's nowhere to anchor it because that's the end of the row. Then you turn. So go ahead and try on your own 4, 5, and 6, and then we'll come back together to do row 7, which has a color change. How'd you do? At the end of row 6, you should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares on that last row that you just finished. And you should have a vague triangle shape. Don't worry too much if it doesn't look quite as neat as you want it to. That's why we're making a dishcloth, because even if it turns out real funky, it's still going to be useful. It's still going to be functional. Now row 7 is where we start to do a little bit of color work. So we've got 1 square of color A, which is my gray, then 5 squares of color B, which for me is a light blue, and then back to 1 square of color A. So we have to do a little bit of color change. We are, however, starting the row with the same color. So I'm going to start like I normally would with my 6 chains, and then working my 3 double crochets, starting with the 4th chain from the hook. To change my color, what I want to do is when I go to do my slip stitch to anchor the square I just finished, I do not want to use my gray color, my color A. I'm going to go ahead and snip that, give it a few inches to weave it in, and switch, remember starting a few inches in again to weave it in, switch to my color B, which for me is this aqua color. Finish the slip stitch, and now I have a color change. Go ahead and chain your 3 and double crochet just like you would before. I like to try and bury one of these tails while I'm at it. And there I have my first square in my color B. I'll go ahead and continue all the way up. This says in my pattern that I want 5 squares in color B. So that's 1 square, now looking ahead, before I make my color change here, I can see that the start of row 8 has 2 squares. So remember that I'm going to have a square up here in a minute. So row 8 is going to be up here and then above where I just did. But then I'm going to switch back to my B, my color blue, which is going to go in the same space. So I'm going to work this like I would a piece of intarsia color work, where I'm going to try my hardest to not have to cut my colors wherever possible. Now the gray, because it's going to kind of come up around the edges, I am going to have to switch that color officially and weave in those ends at the end of each row. But I'm going to try really hard to not have to do that for my blue, because I don't want to weave in the ends because I hate doing it. So I'll go ahead and slip stitch here into my last square, but I've finished with my blue, so I'm going to do this with my gray. Pull that blue nice and snug so the gray doesn't run away from me. Chain 3 and do your last square for the round. And again, I'm going to try and start weaving in that tail when I do these 3 double crochets. That'll just keep it nice and secure as I work. There we go. So that's row 7. I have 1 in my color A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in my color B, and 1 again in my color A. Moving on to row 8, I'm starting with color A, and I want 2 squares. So chain my 6, do your flip, and I want to try and kind of weave in this end while I'm at it. So I'll show you how I weave in my ends while I'm working here to do my color changes. Because I really hate weaving in all the ends all at once at the end. I find it very tedious. I don't want to do that. So if I can, I prefer to weave them in while I'm working. So what I want to do is, as I go to anchor this square, I'm going to put it down for just a second and quick grab my tapestry needle for a bit of weave as we go. And I like to go just through this set of double crochets, pull it up here, and then I'm going to kind of pull it along these chains, weave it through there, and that way I can resume my next square, but I'm going to hold on to that tail so that as I do these 3 double crochets into this chain space, I'm going over that end, over that tail one more time. And I think that's woven in enough. I might do this, if I had more gray squares that I was going to do on this row, I might kind of try and follow it up with me a little bit more, but since I don't, I think that's probably secure enough. And if it's not, you know what, it's a dishcloth. It's not the end of the world. So in row 8, I've got 2 of my gray squares there with color A, and I'm going to switch back to color B. So switching back to color B, like I said, I don't want to have to cut this. I would rather work it kind of intarsia. And it is going to float its way up, but since it's a matching color block, I'm not super worried about it. If this was something that I was making that was larger, that was not a dishcloth, I might want to cut it and weave in the end, but it's a dishcloth and I don't care enough to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and do my slip stitch here, switching my colors while I do it. Now the gray I do have to cut because I'm going to need it again at the end of the row. And could I do something similar with gray? Yes, but you know what? I've only got 1 ball of gray and I don't feel like making a separate ball. So now we are going to do 5 blocks of this B color, 5 blocks of my gray. And one thing you may have noticed on this color change is it's not super clean. I could, if I wanted to, do my color change on the last half of the double crochet prior. I don't think it looks that bad, personally. It's just such a small piece, and once I weave in this end, it's really not going to be noticeable. I find it easier to do color changes in this context. I find it easier to do color changes on the slip stitch. But if you want it to be really clean, then you should do it on the second half of your double crochet from the previous square. So we are now at the end of our 5 blocks in color B. So we're going to go ahead and switch back to color A for that last block. At least we will if I can manage to make this slip stitch. There we go. Okay, and that's it. That is the end of row 8. So you're going to notice the rest of these are all done in sort of the same kind of pattern where we're going to switch from gray to blue and back to gray. The only difference between these next couple rows, 9, 10, 11, and the row we just finished is how many squares of each you're going to have at one time. So you do actually need to pay attention to that. So for example, row 9 begins with just 1 letter A, 1 gray square, 6 blue, and then 2 grays at the end. And that's kind of going to match up with the one that we just did. So it's going to be 1 up here and then 2 down here. And then row 10, you're going to begin, we're now down here, with 3 gray, 6 blue, and again 1 gray. So row 9, 10, and 11, try those on your own. We're going to meet up together at row 12 to start decreasing because we've almost got our widest diagonal here. Our widest diagonal is going to be row 11, and then we're going to start decreasing, and that's a little bit of a shift, and it does mean less chaining, so I always get really excited when we get to that point. So go ahead and do rows 9, 10, and 11 on your own, and then we'll come back together and starting on row 12. Okay, we have now finished row 11, which is the longest row, which means we reached the halfway point, and we're just about to push beyond it. Because we're at the halfway point, I did go ahead and weave in most of those ends with the exception of this one, just so that I don't have to do all of them later. So we are now going to start decreasing at both ends because we're going to be making a square, and we're making a square because it's easier. You don't have to track like which side's getting bigger and which side's getting smaller. So we have been increasing as we went along at both ends, and now we're going to start decreasing at both ends. So when we go ahead and flip, you should start to see a heart pattern taking shape in that B color. For me, it's that aqua. So the only difference when you decrease instead of increasing is what happens at the beginning of the row. Normally, we would chain 6, and that's going to add a square above the one that we just finished. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to add any squares in that direction. We only want our squares to go to the side. of where we've been working because we want to get smaller. So what we're going to do instead is start to slip stitch into these double crochets, 1, 2, and then into the top of that chain 3 slip stitches. And now we're right where we would be if we had made that square and then anchored it. So I'm gonna go ahead and rotate here because this is the way I want to work. In this row, I am doing 3 in my gray, 3 in my A, and then switching to 6 for B. So now that I'm in that spot, this is exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and make the squares the same way that I have been doing it for the rest of this project. The only real difference is that at the beginning, I slip stitch instead of chaining, and that is the only difference between an increased space and a decreased space. And also notice the way I'm counting is going to be a little different because I had been counting from corners before for my row, but my row is actually starting above the corner now because I'm no longer, going into that corner, making those new corners. So here I've done 2. Go ahead and anchor that. Whoops. Oh dear. What is that yarn doing? See if I can save it. I cannot. Try again. If your yarn splits like that, I often find the easiest thing is to just take out the stitch that you did and do it over. Sometimes you can save it, depending on how bad it's split. There we go. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and switch to color B. And work my 6 squares. Is 6. Go ahead and switch back to color A. Before I switch back to color A, I just want to show you a trick for weaving in ends as you go. So here I've got where my slip knot was from the last row and I ended it. What I'm actually going to do is go through these double crochets and kind of just use my hook to weave it through these stitches because they don't have to go into these stitches at any point. So I'm just going to weave the end through. And now I've got it at the top where I'll be able to hold it and work it into those double crochets into that chain space. Go ahead and continue like normal. Except this chain is being rude to me. There we go. Switch my color. and this is going to let me start working to weave these two ends in, these two gray ends at the same time. And that is the end of row 12. The only difference here is I'm just going to go ahead and anchor it. And it's not going to be in the corner, but that's okay. So that's it. That's the end of row 12. And now the nice thing about being past that halfway point is that everything is going to start to work a little more quickly. Your rows are going to go by faster. So when we turn, remember, this is a decrease row on both sides. So we are not chaining. We are instead going to slip stitch into these double crochets, just working our way across that square that we just finished. Oops. And then into the last, the top of that chain. And now we're ready to go. Working our way up. And we're going to work all the way through the rest of these rows, paying close attention to how many of each color we need until we finally get to the end, and I'll show you how to finish off when we get to the end. So I'm going to see you again in row 20. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to work. I've just finished row number 19, which means we've only got 2 rows left, row 20 and row 21. And you can really see my heart shape now. I'm all done with my color B, I'm all done with my aqua, I'm only working on this gray, and I just have left this one corner. So as I'm doing my final decreases here, whoops, that's not a loop, there we go. My final decrease rows here, doing my slip stitches across to start my final rows. I just want to talk a little bit about corner to corner crochet in general. You'll notice as you make this, it is more full of holes than typical crochet fabric. And typical crochet fabric still has a lot of holes in it. So that's saying something. And that is both a good and bad characteristic for the fabric, depending on what you want to use it for. So in this case, I'm saying this is going to be dishcloth. Well, it's got a lot of holes in it, so I probably won't want to be wiping up anything really gross, but it's just fine to be wiping my counters. And actually these little ridges that are created here are going to be really good, kind of like scrubby bits to help me get stuff off of the counters, like you know, like flour that's been mixed with water from making bread, for example. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. It also makes it really good for baby items, like if you're going to make a baby blanket, which I'll show you one in just a few minutes here, like the one that I made. It's really good for that because the risk of suffocation is very low because there's so many holes. Again, even more so than regular crochet. So it's a great choice for that. But I probably wouldn't want to use this to make like a scarf that I really wanted to help keep me warm, because it's got so many holes in it, and if it actually gets cold where you live, that's a problem. So to do that last row, it's exactly the same as all your other decrease rows. The difference is you don't have to turn. Just cut. And oh, I split my yarn, of course I did. Goodness, what happened? There we go. So you do that last slip stitch, cut off your yarn with a little wiggle room to weave in, and just pull it all the way through. So everything is done. I just need to weave in all of my ends. And just like that, we're all done. One of the things you might notice with corner to corner crochet is that the edges are not quite as neat as you would get with some other forms of crochet. So again, this is a dishcloth. I'm not going to be giving it a border because I don't care enough. However, this is a good case where if the edges bother you, definitely add a border to whatever you're working on. Even just a plain like once around single crochet is really going to clean up those edges and make it look a lot nicer. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you found this tutorial to be helpful. Remember, you can also post questions in the comments, or you can hop over to the blog and get a copy of written instructions as well as a printout copy of the pattern to make the corner to corner crochet heart dishcloth. If you enjoyed this tutorial or you found it even just a little bit helpful, please do remember to go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you want to see more of my stuff. So thanks for watching. Enjoy your crochet.